Just a few days ago, after months of turmoil, there appeared to be a breakthrough in the standoff between the opposition and the president in Ukraine. But in just 48 hours, there was a U-turn, and Ukraine witnessed its bloodiest day. Over 20 people killed, including police officers. Russia is calling foul, blaming the U.S. and EU, while the president of Ukraine has said this was a coup and power grab. In this edition of the debate, we'll discuss where Ukraine is headed and why this standoff echoes U.S.-Russia Cold War tensions.
The Ukrainian capital Kiev has turned into a scene of war these days as deadly clashes rage on between anti-government protesters and security forces. The recent violence is seen as the worst in the country's post-Soviet history.
Now this is the last war. This is the last chance for us. If now we will fall down, everything will be broken.
The situation got out of control outside the parliament building on Tuesday morning when government supporters inside the parliament blocked opposition attempts to scale back President Viktor Yanukovych's constitutional powers. The president has blamed the opposition leaders for the unrest. Viktor Yanukovych says he's ready to resolve the crisis through talks.
I've been calling for dialogue since the very beginning of today's confrontation, as I categorically don't support forceful variants, and I especially don't support bloodshed. It's my life principle that no power is worth a drop of blood spilled for it.
But the opposition accuses the embattled president of not listening to its demands and using excessive force against protesters.
I'm very unhappy because it was no discussion and president don't want to listen opposition. They don't want to listen, and just one way.
The recent wave of violence comes in the wake of mass protests which broke out back in November when the president rejected a landmark association and trade deal with the European Union in favor of closer ties with Moscow. Some observers view the crisis in Ukraine as the collateral damage of a conflict between the United States and Europe on one side and Russia on the other. There are now rising concerns that the bloody unrest in Ukraine could raise the stakes in a renewed East-West contest, which is reminiscent of the Cold War.
You're watching the debate. Let me introduce our guest, former Moscow correspondent of The Times, Christopher Walker, joins us from London. And from the Voice of Russia radio station, Dmitry Babich joins us from Moscow. Gentlemen, welcome. Christopher Walker, from protests which began late November to this. It was just 3 days ago where it appeared there was a breakthrough when the government accepted amnesty for these jailed demonstrators. What do you think is going on here? Do you believe that this is just a protest movement, or is there foul play?
I think it's a bit of both, and also it's been very badly handled, I think, by the president, because, as you said, it looked as though there might be some sort of breakthrough, and then there was a row in Parliament, and they wouldn't allow any changes to the Constitution to go through. Now, of course, it's become very much a struggle between Russia on the one side, America and the EU on the other. And Ukraine is very much divided between itself and caught in the middle. This does look now like the end game. I think it'll, in the next 48 hours, will judge whether the violence can be brought under some control or we are spiraling towards a civil war, because there has been an order that the paratroopers go in tonight to guard government buildings, defense buildings throughout the country. These ominous ratcheting up of events seem to come without any much help of mediation, and tomorrow the EU is going to consider imposing sanctions on the Ukraine leadership. If that was to go ahead, and there is a big question mark, there could be even more anger on those streets, this time those who are against the EU.
Well, let's talk about these sanctions, Dmitry Babich. You have calls coming in, well, it's a course of calls, isn't it? The EU, the United States, France, the UK, Germany, all calling for targeted sanctions. Does that sound normal for you, that so quickly it appears, for these countries to come out immediately. Kind of sounds like the scenario that went down with Syria, doesn't it? Okay, let me address this to you, Christopher Walker. These course of calls for sanctions, the fires are still burning there, and it's just coming so quickly. I mentioned the United States, France, the EU, also the UK joining that list. Even the UN rights chief to have called for a probe into the clashes. No sooner did the most recent clashes take place. Do you find that a bit surprising, coming so quickly?
I think it is surprising, but I think it's also symptomatic of the fact that the EU have not done very much on the ground to support their case. Particularly, they haven't offered anything compared with the $15 billion of economic aid that Putin is promising to pump into the ailing Ukrainian economy. The EU, as usual, 28 members, often can't agree amongst itself about monetary matters. And the sanctions, although it's going to be proposed tomorrow, there is a rumour that Belgium does not approve of that move. And of course, every one of the 28 members has to be agreed. It has to be unanimous. So we're not there yet, but there is a very much Syrian echo about the way that this is going, except, as you remember, the efforts on the west side to come to an agreement sort of collapsed in the end when only France supported the American call for some sort of military action, and there wasn't any.
Well, let's look at what Russia has said, and this is not just Russia, Christopher Walker, that has made some deductions to this effect, and that's the fact that several Western countries, as they've said, bear responsibility for the current events by encouraging opposition, for example, to provocative actions. Extremists also are to blame for the events. Do you think that there's a hand by Western countries in this regards? Because one of the announcements that has come out from the Ukrainian government security service is that they're on alert. They're actually going through executing anti-terrorist activities, announcing a nationwide anti-terrorist operation.
Yes, I think there is. The West's making no secret, really, particularly the EU, about how it's determined to win Ukraine's influence away from the former Soviet Union, the Russia. It really wants, it seems, to get the economic claw into the Ukraine, but at the same time, don't be fooled when they talk about those liberation movements in the square and such like. They're not all liberals. There's some very right-wing Ukrainian nationalist groups amongst that party, as it were, and so there's no absolute simplicity here, one side's good, one side's bad, or anything like that. It's much more complicated, and that's why they haven't come anything near to finding a way of negotiating a compromise. There were talks only 24 hours ago between the opposition parties, the political parties, and the government, and they just broke down in disarray.
Let's get a point of view from Moscow. Dmitry Babich, you're looking at things unfolding there in Ukraine. The Russian foreign minister has come out making several statements, one of them saying that there's a coup attempt. What's your reading into what is going on?
Well, indeed, it's one of the cases when I can agree with the assessment of the Russian Foreign Ministry. It's a real attempt to seize power in the country, and the problem is that obviously the violence was restarted. It was restarted by the extremist nationalist groups, which don't make any secret out of their hatred for Russia and out of their admiration for those Ukrainian nationalists who cooperated with the Nazis during the Second World War. So these groups resorted to violence, and the problem is that the so-called moderate opposition parties in Ukraine did not shy away from these extremists, but said that this is, a popular movement, this is liberation, the government is to blame for everything, so they hope to gain power by violence. They hope to come to power on the backs of these extremists. And one even more terrible thing is the fact that the EU supports these nationalists. During the whole day, the EU Commission head, Mr. Barroso, the head of the EU diplomacy, Catherine Ashton, they have been talking about sanctions against Ukraine, and they are going to target government officials, they are going to target Mr. Yanukovych's family and friends, and they are not going to target the nationalists who are indeed responsible for what happened. And the Polish Prime Minister, for example, blamed Russia for the violence in Ukraine, although not a single Russian official visited Ukraine during the last 3 months, while, for example, Catherine Ashton spent several days there, and the Polish officials also visited Ukraine many times. So indeed, this is a direct interference into the internal affairs of a sovereign state.
Well, let's open up this ultranationalist groups that you mentioned there, and I'd like to address this to you again, Dmitry Babich. This would concern this Dmitry Yarosh, who's the leader of Pravi Sector, which is a coalition of these ultranationalist groups, of which I believe right in the House of Trade Unions at Independence Square on the 5th floor. This is the militant side of the revolution, of which this group represents that. Now, I find it interesting because they say that they are against outside interference, but they're also against President Viktor Yanukovych and his government, and they're against Russia. How did you reach the conclusion that the EU, for example, is supporting these ultranationalist groups? Is this one of the groups that the EU is supporting based on the statement you made?
Well, the EU will not say openly that we support Pravy sector, which means, the rightist sector. They are not going to say openly that we support the so-called Freedom Party or Svoboda, which openly espouses nationalist views. They are not going to say it openly. But Catherine Ashton met publicly with the leader of the Svoboda Party, Mr. Oleksandr Yakymenko, who openly accused Russians and Jews for everything that happened in Ukraine, for all of Ukraine's misfortunes. On several occasions he did that. The EU is not going to support him publicly, but the EU officials meet him, and the EU officials absolutely required from the Ukrainian authorities not to bring these people to justice. When Mr. Yanukovych, just 2 days ago, released 234 so-called protesters, who are indeed not protesters, but criminals, because these were not just the people who expressed their opinion, these were the people who were burning policemen alive, who were attacking government buildings. So all of them were released, and then the US State Department also required from the Ukrainian government to stop all investigations into their activities, to drop all the criminal cases. So you have this indirect support from the European Union and from the United States. They shield these groups from any kind of government repression, from any kind of punishment from the government. Indeed, the position of the European Union is very, very hypocritical. On the one hand, they say that we only support the liberals, we only support the peaceful demonstrators, but you can see with your own eyes that the people who are burning cars, people who are burning trucks, people who attack police with Molotov cocktails, these are not peaceful demonstrators, and the EU supports them. So you just need to look at the television screen to understand that the EU is very hypocritical and that it indeed supports neo-Nazis. without saying so openly.
Well, it is indeed the case, Christopher Walker, of this dangerous ultra-nationalist groups, and based on the conclusions reached by Dmitry Babiš, that the EU, not openly saying it, but they're supporting it along with the U.S. And I'm reading over here that, for example, this particular group has amassed a lethal arsenal of weapons. In an interview, by the way, from the Time, he declined to say exactly how many guns they have, but he said it is enough to defend all of Ukraine from the internal occupiers, in reference to the governments. And at the same time, this anti-terrorist operation from the governments, of which the Ukrainian president just replaced the army chief, I believe, just an hour ago, the head of the army's general staff. We're heading, it appears, Christopher Walker, for a dangerous combination of the government forces of Ukraine to deal with groups such as this, which, by the way, have been accounted to have resulted in some of the deaths coming from this group, from gunfire from that 5th floor. Are we looking at a crisis in the form of a civil war in Ukraine, Christopher Walker?
I think we're getting dangerously close to it. We'll have to see how this new change in army tactics, putting in the paratroopers that's coming very soon, the change in personnel. It does look as though there is something very ominous in the cooking pot, as it were. And the trouble is that the EU, although it's been on the ground, as your contributor from Moscow rightly says, Catherine Ashton has been there quite a lot. But that doesn't mean, excuse me, that they understand what's going on, and they don't really distinguish very much between the liberals and the ultranationalists. They just brand them all together when they should really be looking towards who's doing the real violence.
Well, let's look at the worst-case scenario here, Dmitry Babiš. At least one of the scenarios that may evolve here. A high-ranking Russian official has said that Russia may decide to come into Ukraine in terms of providing its security. Do you see that as a possibility in terms of having Russia involved in the crisis?
No, I think that's absolutely excluded. Russia does not have the desire to interfere into Ukrainian affairs. We were ready to help economically when it looked like a compromise could be reached between various factions inside the Ukrainian political elite. But there is absolutely no question of Russia occupying Ukraine or bringing its troops there. The problem with the EU officials is that they live in a mythological world created by their own press. And the Ukrainian extremist nationalists, they also live in a mythological world that they created for themselves. For example, today in Lvov, which is western Ukraine, the most nationalist part of Ukraine, the people blocked the military units. They prevented soldiers from entering and exiting their barracks. But this is not the Soviet army. The Soviet army does not exist, it hasn't been there for 22 years now. This is their Ukrainian army. Their Ukrainian 18 years old boys are serving there. But they think that these are some sort of internal occupiers, these are enemies of the people, these are Kremlin stooges. So you have this conspiracy mentality, which unfortunately spread itself to the European press. You know, a lot of journalists in the UK, in Germany, in France, especially in Poland, they repeat these lies. And the EU officials seem to be sort of taken hostage by these lies. They come to Kiev, they see the violence from the extremist groups, but they believe their press, they don't believe their eyes. They don't speak the language. We Russians, we understand Ukrainians, we speak, or at least we understand their language, so we know what they are talking about. The EU officials believe their press, which is just completely misleading on the Ukrainian question.
Well, Christopher Walker, I need to ask you about the conversation between the U.S. State Department official Victoria Nuland and how her conversation was leaked with the U.S. ambassador to Ukraine. Doesn't this spell interference by the U.S. when she said Vitaly Klitschko, the boxer-turned politician, who's one of the main opposition leaders, should not be in a new government? Because she said that this is not part of the strategy for political transition. Isn't that clearly interference?
Absolutely. There's no doubt about it. And perhaps you should also go on to explain that the Americans showed very much contempt for the EU. In fact, the word that they used about them is not one we usually use on public television. They were extremely contemptuous of the EU performance and really saying, look, we're the Americans, we're the ones who should be running this show. These EU people are pretty useless. That has been a widespread view in Washington for some time. But one particular problem here also we should pinpoint, I think, in the debate is the fact that the opposition, we talk about the opposition, but they don't, there isn't a single man that the president can negotiate with. There are various political leaders of various groups. Some of them are right-wing. It's not simple, and I agree with your colleague that the journalists, and I am a journalist of course, do tend to simplify the situation because, as he says, the language is very much a problem, and the Europeans do not really find themselves much at home. They don't speak Ukrainian, that's for a start, and they get on so much better in West Ukraine, which is looking towards Europe and which, you know, speaks their language in inverted commas. Whereas Eastern Ukraine, where the big support for Russia is, they, one, speak Russian, and two, they have all the heavy industry. So you really have got the potential there for a split, a country which could split along the lines of other previous ex-Soviet countries, which could be very dangerous and very bloody indeed.
Very well, we're going to leave it there. Thank you very much. Former Moscow correspondent from The Times, Christopher Walker. I also like to thank Dmitry Babich from the Voice of Russia radio station. And thank you for watching another edition of The Debate. From me, Kavitagwe, and the entire team in the capital, Tehran. It's goodbye.